go.
What's up guys, my name is Akuro and I want to show you in this video how I made the sound. Great, so let's jump into it. So I've got it split off from that audio channel just because it actually ended up taking up a lot of my CPU when recording, so hopefully there isn't any audio dropouts. But yeah, here we go. So the idea for this sound was to essentially start out with a really sort of rich, harmonically rich, synthesized sound, and take a bunch of post-processing that's utilizing vocoders to kind of morph that into something that's organic and has a lot of movement to it. So if I actually turn off all of the post-processing that's going on in this little synth here, we get this sound, which is just the pure serum output, which is pretty cool. It's pretty rich, but not as movement and organic oriented as the final product. So let's start there. Let's start with the synthesis part, and let's actually turn off some of the automation that's going on, just because I'm automating a few things within Serum as well as some of the effects within the post-processing here. And let's take a listen to everything with automations turned off, just with the Serum patch. So cool. It's still pretty thick, pretty fat, but it's not as nuanced. So let's jump into Serum here. You'll notice right off the bat, I don't really have anything complicated or crazy going on. I'm actually not using any of the LFOs. I am automating a couple parameters through automation, but nothing being automated within Serum here. So I'll walk you through the sound and turn off the other two oscillators, the filter, and the effects here. So I wanted to start off with a very harmonically rich wavetable. So I chose tried and trusty old square wave, very fat, great place to start. And I wanted to FM that. So I actually just chose a sine wave to FM. And you'll notice I'll have the FM is up pretty high here. That's adding all those extra high harmonics. It took away some of the fatness in the low end, but that's totally fine. And the next thing that I really wanted to play with was the bend plus, bend minus warping here. And you can add some movement to the sound if you modulate this, which can be really cool. So I'll actually copy over the automation I have from the original patch, and you get to listen to what it sounds like here if I have it plugged in. Great, so now we've got some extra movement to the sound here. And the next thing I wanted to do is add that extra bit of harmonics by having the third oscillator on, going directly out and layered with a sawtooth wave. So there's not too much extra stuff that's added on, but once I get to the filter, it'll fill in some of the gaps that are cleared out by the filter. So if we jump to the effects tab, I just have some distortion going on before, after. It's not super noticeable, but it adds some of that mid-range and low-end back, and a little bit of extra volume. It drives up all the way. And after that, I have effectively what is an OTT using the multi-band setting for the compressor, and mixed in a little bit, not all the way. So this squishes the sound and makes it a little bit more cohesive. If we jump back over, now we get to the filter section where I'm actually scooping out some of the frequencies. So I've been using the phaser filters within Serum a lot recently, and they've been really interesting. If you basically enable the key tracking, so that way whenever you change keys, the filter, the cutoff will move, and you'll see that it'll jump around when it plays the different notes. Sounds cool. And you also notice that even though it's taking away harmonics, it seems to be emphasizing them, just because when they're not there, your ear kind of notices that, and it almost kind of implies them. So if you were to take the cutoff and tune it to a specific frequency, it can have some really interesting results, and kind of add some of that yoiness back to the sound, some vocalness. So that's the Serum patch. As I mentioned, it was pretty simple, and let's jump into the post-processing. So I wanted to add some additional movement to the sound. And what I've been doing recently is doing that using AutoPan. And by default, when you load up AutoPan, it's just kind of configured for basically making the sound bounce back and forth between the left and right channels of your output. Which can be really cool, but it does it for everything. It does the entire signal. So you have all the low frequencies doing that as well. But I want to have that still pretty centered in the stereo field to have that punch. And what I've been doing is taking the default and taking the phase and aligning the phases between the left and right channels. So as I mentioned, by default, it's bouncing the sound between the left and right. And how it's doing that is just changing the volume of the left and right channels at different shapes here. So there's 180 degrees phase offset between these sine waves, making it sound like it's bouncing left and right. But if you were to line up the phases perfectly, then it changes the volume of both the left and right channels at the same time. And this just makes the sound like it's going whoa, whoa, whoa. And you get some really cool sounds. And it's basically just doing amplitude modulation. You're modulating the amplitude of the signal coming through. So what I've done is just that. I'll copy over my automations. And here we go. So you notice not only am I changing the rate, but also the amount. At this part, I wanted the signal to be kind of stagnant and not have the amplitude changing too much. So at the start, it goes pretty fast, but then it smooths out, and then it starts modulating again, which has some really interesting sounds. Great. And one other thing that I also forgot to mention is I'm doing some pitch bending here, and this is just coming straight from Serum. So I have it pitching down from either an octave or 2 octaves up. Let's see, 2 octaves here. So you can actually change the pitch modulation range. So I did it all the way up to 24, and that's 2 octaves. So it starts 2 octaves up and pitches down. So you can see as you start stacking on automations and modulation, you can get some really interesting sounds. The next part of the processing, which really gives that organic, sort of watery, flowy sort of sound, is a bunch of vocoders that I have. I have a vocoder rack going on, where I have a couple of different parallel chains with different processing on them to add that thick, sort of wet, sloppy sound. And with it on, it's going to sound like this. Really nice, really nice. So before I kind of jump in this, because it's a little bit complex, I'll turn it off and just talk about vocoders in general and how you could use a vocoder to make this sound. So when you load up vocoder, there's a couple of things that you want to change. And you'll notice that my default vocoder values are different than Ableton's. I set up a custom version for it. But Ableton will have a much lower range value. I think it's somewhere around 12K for the upper range of the vocoder. So I'll come back to that. But basically, a vocoder is a really cool device where you can take the input of the sound and choose a carrier, which will change what the sound sounds like. And it'll kind of fuse these two signals together in an interesting way. So to create this sound, you want to choose the modulator as the carrier, and the modulator is actually the input. So the input is modulating itself with this setting. I like to turn on the enhance setting. It has a little bit more crispness to it, and you'll notice that when I play the sound, all these bands are jumping around, and these are actually different frequency bands, and you can kind of look at it as an EQ, but instead of having different nodes to move around, you have all these different bands, and you could actually draw in different curves that change the sound of the output. And coming back to the range, these settings specify the lowest part, the lowest frequency, and the highest frequency that are covered within these bands that you set. You could actually set however many bands from this menu here. But as I was mentioned before, I believe the default Ableton setting is around 12K, and if you compare that to 18K, it's a lot duller and a lot less sharp. So I always crank it up to 18K to have the extra crispness going on. Now, while this is great, it doesn't have that wet texture that I'm looking for. And how you actually really get that is changing the gate. Now, many of you guys have used a gate before, and for those not familiar, it's effectively a threshold that you can set, say -10 dB. And if you have the input signal coming in that falls below this threshold, it'll squish it down to complete silence. And in the context of a vocoder, it'll do that by every single frequency band. So say this particular band here, it was going above -10 dB, doing good, and then it suddenly dips below. Then the gate will squash it to -infinity dB to complete silence. But it will only do it for that band. And it'll have a gate on every single one of these bands effectively. So that way, the entire signal won't go completely dead. It will just be that specific frequency band. And this can create a really interesting sound. So I'll loop this section here and mess around with the gate, and you'll kind of see how things change once I get up to a specific level. So if I go all the way up to 12, there's no input signal that's coming in other than the sub, which I'll get to later, that goes above. You get some really interesting textures from the sound. And the one drawback is because of the nature of the sound is stripping away content, it's not as full and as rich. So I wouldn't want to just have this one vocoder in and say, oh yeah, this is the bass sound. For the kind of sound I was going for, you can go for if you're trying to do some interesting freeform bass type style. You could probably get away with having, less full frequency content. But for this particular bass, I wanted to have something that was really fleshed out, really rich. So how can I do this? Well, my solution was to take this idea and split it across a couple different bands. So I'll have a low frequency band, mids, highs, and another high frequency band, and have a different vocoder on each one of these bands to kind of change the gate to match what I wanted for that specific band, and have some post-processing after it to achieve some extra beef in the low end and some extra width in the high end. So at this point, due to the fact that my CPU is dying because I'm running OBS, Serum, and Ableton, and it's basically like a 6-year-old laptop with only 8 gigs of RAM, I bounced out the bass that I have so far and have the processing left to do on those channels. And you may notice, hey, he's got 2 different channels that he's bounced out. Why is that? And you may not have noticed, but in my original chain up here, I have the Serum chain, which we were talking about before, that has the bass, and I also actually have a sub chain. Now, a lot of people don't realize that you can have more than one instrument on one MIDI channel, and I'll demonstrate. If I already create a new MIDI channel, and let's throw an operator on there. And the next step is to group it, Command G, Control G, click open to show the chain view. And say I wanted a second operator, this time that has like a different waveform on it, whatever. And you can kind of keep going. You could even put a drum rack on here. You could put a bunch of random stuff together. And I don't know what context you would want to have a drum rack and an operator on the same channel, but it makes you wonder if anyone's actually tried to make a track just using one MIDI channel and stacking all the instruments, samples, and whatnot in here. And because you can do it, you can kind of chain out the MIDI so that way different sections of MIDI octaves apply to different instruments. So I challenge you to try and do this. It'd be a really interesting result. So yeah, and the reason why I have 2 different channels here or rather 2 different chains here for the sub is I like to keep my sub separate from my bass. A lot of people will have their subs in the same patch as their Serum and then sort of frequency split from there. So they may have a sub here, but for me, this isn't acting as a sub. It's actually acting as more harmonics. So I'm not treating it as the sub, and I do high pass things at the end. But it's really nice to have it separate, because a lot of people keep it, as I said, in one patch, and their frequencies can overlap, and you can't split those out. So it's nice to keep them separate, and that's what I've done. So that's the reason why I have 2 different channels. And if you're curious as to what I'm actually using as a sub for this sound, it's just an operator with the triangle wave. I've been using triangles a lot for subs because they have a lot, they're a lot more rich harmonics they have than a sine wave. So that'll definitely help stand out. Things sound a lot more fat, and I could definitely hear a lot more dubstep and other genres are using really, really, really thick harmonic subs. And so I have the same auto pan that I had on my first channel as the same automation, and then an auto filter, which is just rolling off some of the harmonics that I didn't want that kind of clashed with the original sound. So I'll disable this, and we'll kind of pick up where we were, talk about vocoders. So just a quick before or after, and with all the vocoders, we got that really nice organic sound. And let's kind of go band by band what I've done. So in the low band, I've rolled off some of the high frequencies in the vocoder, added a little bit of drive here with the saturator, and cut off some more frequencies I didn't want. So the goal for this band was to kind of create a constant sort of thick, rubbery low end, which sounds good. With the mids, I kind of did something similar. I kind of have a band pass within the vocoder, and the same with the EQ. And something else to note is when you use this gate approach, it will add some more dynamics back to your sound usually. So that's why I have a compressor on a couple of these to kind of flatten things out, so that way they aren't, just fluttering around as much. And so for reference, for both of those 2 bands together, there's some nice frequencies going on there. And for the highs, so I actually have a chorus introduced before, and this is to add some extra width. I wanted to add some stereo to the next couple bands. And so I'll play it without the chorus first and turn it on. It spreads it out, and things become less cluttered and, a lot more spacious. So if you were to play it with the rest of the bands, we're getting there, but we're still missing that crisp high end, and that's going to come in with this last band. I actually do have another chorus, and here I have the formant, which is pushing the sound up the frequency range to make it sort of sit in a higher frequency range. And I have an EQ to cut out some unwanted frequencies, and a compressor and a limiter to flatten things out a little bit. And that band really tickles your ears. And all together, it sounds like this. Great. And now we're almost there. But at this point, I realized, hey, I'm missing some of the thickness, some of the fatness, and I wanted a little bit more stereo. So this extra next step with this delay, I would maybe take out or adjust depending on how I'm trying to mix this into a song. And right now, it's really subtle. It's not adding a whole lot of stereo, but it's a really quick delay, 21.1 milliseconds ping pong. And if you were just to 100% wet the signal with it on, it would sound like this. So it kind of adds that sort of tonal metallic delay, and it's mixed in just slightly to add that little bit more fuzz, that little bit more width to the sound. And the last couple effects are just to achieve more thickness and loudness. So I've got your classic OTT, but this time it's not at 100%. It's mixed down a little bit. And another thing that I've been doing a lot is adjusting this time parameter. And what this does is it scales all of the time parameters associated with the device. If you have it past 100%, it basically scales them down to be faster. So the faster that these parameters are, the tighter the compressor is going to be. And one problem that I've perceived with a lot of people that use a lot of OTT on sounds and don't kind of tweak it to match the sounds is that if you were to keep the time to be really slow, these attacks and releases are going to be really slow. And so that means if you have artifacts after the main body of your sound are going to end, and like little reverb tails, that's going to be upwardly pushed. It's going to be expanded to be really loud, and you'll hear little bits and pieces after your bass, which can sound cool in their own context, but when you're trying to have a really tight mix down, that can really muddy and clutter up your mix and be really difficult to mix in, or just have to bounce it audio and cut it down, whatever. So increasing the time can get rid of that, and it just makes things get really close to being a limiter, because the attack and release times are going to be really fast. So in this particular circumstance, it's not going to make a huge difference. So if I were to put it at 100% and the time be 100%, and then crank it up, it doesn't make a huge difference in this context, but in others it can't really. And of course in EQ, to cut out the low frequencies, because I wanted my sub channel to fill those in, and boost some of the highs a little bit. And then a huge boost at saturation at the end to make things a lot louder, add a little bit of distortion, and just squish things together a little bit more. So since my CPU is dropping out, I'll just kind of show the bounced version that I had at the end. And I'll make sure to turn these guys off. And this is the end result. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for watching this video, and please feel free to leave any suggestions or feedback in the comments. I know this video is a little bit long, but I didn't really want to edit out a lot of things, and I kind of wanted to walk through my process for making the sound, and I hope that it was helpful to you. And thanks so much for watching, also especially because this is my first video, and it's kind of a soft opening for a bunch of series that I really want to dig into, and some of which being some other tutorials similar to this one, others being perhaps critical track review series of well-known artists, or perhaps even viewer submissions, submitting their tracks and getting mixed feedback, mastering feedback on that. And I also really want to do some sort of more informational video essay type deep dives on topics such as DSP, psychoacoustics, and sort of bridging the gap between the technical analysis of it, some math, some science, and bringing it home to how you can apply these concepts to your recording and your production. So great, thanks so much. Like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz. See you later.